and welcome to the ERP Organizational Change Journal podcast, brought to you by Nestell and Associates. Nestell and Associates is an ERP organizational change management firm serving the private equity industry. Hello, my name is Jonathan Donald, the founder of Invert Ventures, a change strategy firm. I'm here with my friend and co-host, Dr. Jack Nestell, the founder of Nestell and Associates. The ERP Organizational Change Journal podcast seeks to share expertise, insight, and create effective conversation to help guide ERP organizational change to real, measurable, and verified success, to expand what we see so we can act in a more effective way. We seek to promote, connect, and foster relationships in the ERP and organizational change community. The primary purpose of this podcast is to discuss, share, and reflect upon effective and efficient ways in which to realize ERP organizational change success. We will discuss the people, process, and technological components of ERP organizational change. This podcast is intended as a forum to study, share, and discuss ERP organizational change. It's our sincere hope that this will be a collaboration tool and resource, and that we hope you will find this podcast useful as we share lessons learned, explore best practices, and discover the human elements of ERP organizational change. Our podcast draws on knowledge from extensive research, collaborative learning, and practitioner experience of both project successes and failures. A general review of the theme of ERP and organizational change practice, literature, and research suggests that an understanding and critically an awareness of tactics founded in principle is fundamental to ERP organizational change success. Our podcast will discuss these tactics, explore these approaches, and discover the principles that may be useful in addressing your ERP organizational change challenge and risks. We look forward to having you join us. Jack?
Thank you, Jonathan. As we are a podcast that desires to engage in valuable insight into the world of ERP organizational change success with interviews and roundtable talk, our guests include experts and pioneers in the field, which include organizational stakeholders, practitioners, and researchers. We are a discussion on any and all things ERP and organizational change. Our podcast is a platform for those seeking to share, learn, and reflect on ERP organizational change success. In this episode, Organizational Performance Improvement, we will discuss performance improvement and selecting the right performance solutions with our esteemed guest, Dr. Richard E. Clark.
I'm so excited for this conversation. Dr. Clark is the professor of educational psychology and technology at the University of Southern California. Among his many prestigious awards and honors, Dr. Clark was the 2002 recipient of the prestigious Thomas F. Gilbert Professional Achievement Award, awarded by the International Society for Performance Improvement. Dr. Clark is a well-known published author in journal articles, academic circles, but his main book that we'll be discussing today is Turning Research into Results, a guide to selecting the right performance solution. Dr. Clark, along with his co-author, Dr. Fred Estes, discuss in their book, Turning Research into Results, a guide to selecting the right performance solution, that much research has been done on a wide array of performance improvement programs. And from this research, we have a fairly good understanding of what works and what doesn't work. Dr. Clark is here today to help provide insight into how we take advantage of this significant research. We will discuss how organizations and practitioners can apply the results of sound organizational performance research principles to their trades with practical tools and tactics.
Great. Without further ado, let's get into the conversation. Dr. Clark, we are grateful and honored to have you on our podcast today.
Oh, Jack, the honor's mine, and I really appreciate the invitation. Actually, I'm here today because Nestell and Associates and Invert Ventures they're at the forefront of groups that effectively support evidence-based organizational change. My goal, my primary goal in my career is to support all organizations as they consider evidence-based analysis, evidence-based decision-making. And if you think about it, we all should have that goal because all of us get better if we use evidence to make decisions, not just all organizations, but the entire nation, I think, improves as we go forward with this and get better at it.
Thank you, Dr. Clark. Well said. Thank you so much. And, Dr. Clark, as someone who has intensely studied your work and as a student of your work, there's a key question in your book from Dr. Brenda, I believe it's Segru. And it's, quote, if you want to understand why what you are doing works or doesn't work, you need to read this book, referring to you and Dr. Estes' book. In other words, in my opinion, this is a key question that all practitioners should be seeking. What is it about practice that works or doesn't work? What we find is that practice based on sound principles and or research works. And so, the first question then is, in your book, you state research, quote, research evidence dramatically increases the chances that a performance improvement program will succeed. Why is that? I've had successes. Why can't I just rely on my own personal experience and opinions about organizational performance? What's the value in research-based evidence?
Well, I think that's a great question, Jack. Experience is a super guide when it leads to using programs that actually work in the same organizational and business context. And also, I guess, when there's no other cost-beneficial programs that would have performed even better. But, here's the rub. How often is that true, do you think? And what you find when you look at this carefully is that it's very seldom the case. And it's a large part of the reason why it doesn't work is that our minds are programmed to ignore evidence that our understanding of our past experience may not be the best guide for the future. So I'm a psychologist. I'm really curious about how people make decisions and how we make mistakes when we do that. By the way, I think the only Nobel Prize given out in this area was given out for research on decision-making. So it's very well recognized internationally. Just as an example, there's a compelling research on something called the hindsight effect, which suggests that even when we learn that something we supported in the past didn't work, our long-term memory of that event changes. And either we remember that it did work or that we didn't support it. I mean, when I read that, started looking at this research, it was pretty amazing. It's very powerful stuff. So the hindsight effect is, to me, at least responsible for the evidence presented by no less a group than the National Academy of Sciences. They have a book called Enhancing Human Performance. It's a few years old now, but I don't think the evidence in it has changed very much. The Academy researchers, when they looked, found that 2/3 of all organizational change programs fail from 12 to 18 months after they're implemented.
Wow.
What about that? 12 to 18 months, 2/3, 60 to 70%. And the failures are almost always caused by poor choices based on managers' strong but mistaken beliefs that programs are similar to those that have either worked in the past or appeared to work in the past, or advice from friends.
To confirm for our listeners, that's 12 to 18 months after implementation is complete.
After
correct?
Implementation, yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yep. Now, when you stretch out 2 years, the number increases. But if you look at those 2 years, you'll find that most of them fail within the first year. And the fact is that they're often implemented with a lot of fanfare, but the failures are almost very hard to find. They're not reported often. I mean, who wants to talk about having failed?
Right.
Another reason for this, I think, another insight into why this happened was in that wonderful book that a lot of people read by Malcolm Gladwell. It was called, it was called Blink. And it was about the unconscious and automated knowledge that experts have, but often use without being aware of it at all. I remember one of the examples in the book was about a tennis pro who could always predict whether a player he was observing was going to double fault when they were serving, but he couldn't explain how he knew. He was just good at it. He was like 98% accurate or something like that.
Wow, interesting.
Well, Gladwell, yeah, that's terrific. I mean, by the way, these number of examples are huge, and this is one of my interests, is how top experts are so unaware of what they do so successfully and so fluidly. They can do it. They just can't tell you how they do it very accurately.
Which is one of the real questions on if top experts are able to translate their knowledge into teachable lessons.
Yeah, and you know what scares the dickens out of me is that somewhere about 80% of all the trainers in American companies are experts. And it's not that they don't try to do a great job at training. Well, at least they're either giving the training or they designed it. I mean, who would you go to get training done if it's not an expert? And the fact is that experts, we find, because we studied experts in areas where nobody had an excuse to not think that this was an expert. We went to surgeons. I mean, when they succeed or fail is a matter of public record. It has to be recorded. So we know who's good at surgery. And they actually would invent things that they didn't do when they were training their own surgeons. And I know there's ways that they overcome their mistakes, but it's a good example, I think, of how automated this knowledge is. Gladwell said that what people do is that we only look at a little slice of a problem and immediately think that we have a solution that will work. And he makes the case that in some instances the solution can be positive, like the guy that was good at predicting double faults. But in many cases, it's not at all. Another place where we went for advice and for insights about this was a great book by a guy named Dan Wegner at Harvard. This book's called The Illusion of Conscious Will. So he writes about this whole phenomenon. And he also demonstrated that 70% of all decisions that are based on experience are unconscious and automated. And the memory of that experience may not be accurate. It's not that we consciously decide. We think we do, but we actually don't. Wegner described studies that scared me to, I tell you, where you can actually watch people who are asked to make a decision between 2 or 3 different things. You can watch their brain waves when they're monitored. And when they're asked to think about it, make a decision, and what you see on the record of what's going on in their brain is that they actually make the decision, and they start to move their hand towards the thing they've chosen many seconds before they consciously believe that they've made the decision.
Wow.
That is scary stuff. There's more insights here in a more readable book, I think. I just finished a book that knocked my socks off, and it was by a woman named Maria Konnikova. The book is called The Biggest Bluff, and I want to really strongly recommend it. Maria is a PhD psychologist. I think I forget where she did. She was in a really good program, Columbia, I think. And her specialization is decision making. And she actually decided at one point to become a top poker player when she had never played poker before. And this is a true story. She gives great descriptions of her inclination and other people's inclination to completely trust our own opinions and what is basically our very faulty memory of what worked in the past. She describes how to keep that bad stuff from happening using poker as an example. To me, it's a great way to learn about how we confound ourselves when we make decisions, because here there's a lot of money at risk in poker. I mean, the consequence of being wrong can be pretty disastrous. It is for a lot of people. And but the effort to actually get control of the way you make those decisions, to get control of that impulsiveness and that inclination to trust ourselves without analyzing any further, the payoff for that can be huge.
Interesting.
So, yeah, thanks. We review a lot of studies in the book that using evidence-based performance improvement results in very cost-effective benefit to all organizations. There's CE ratios, cost-effectiveness ratios in the hundreds to the thousands that get reported. And can I add one other? If I'm going on too long, shut me up. But There's one other thing that occurs to me. There's a huge number of artificial intelligence programs going on in your industry right now. Yeah. Everybody, not everybody, but a huge number of people are developing them, and they have great promise, I think, to make a huge difference. I'm actually developing an AI program right now. But the risk in developing these things is that if we use opinion as a basis for the AI, then it's going to make the same mistakes that people would. Those AI programs have to have evidence, and they have to be set up in such a way that whatever they recommend, if it doesn't work, it has to be recorded and corrected. And that's not necessarily the way that an AI program is designed.
Yeah, good point.
Dr. Clark, I found myself sitting here nodding my head, and this generally happens with guests who bring up whether it's confirmation bias or the biggest bluff. I also recommend the book if you're looking for a shorter, digestible view. There was a great conversation between Maria and Shane Parrish by the Knowledge Project. Yeah. Amazing listen. We can include that in the notes. Dr. Clark, there's so many ways we could take this conversation. I'm so glad we spent the first bit of it establishing, we may not always realize our own biases. One of the things I often see in organizations, and you had a few key points on this in your book, is that so many times when we're doing organizational change or implementations, the individual or the unit organizational performance solution doesn't really align with the organizational goals, vision, and means to get there. And I can account from my own personal experience bringing this up and presenting this in executive rooms and getting this blank look. Can you tell us more about A, why this is so important, B, why it doesn't happen nearly as much as this conversation I would expect, and then let's talk about how we can do that more effectively at all levels of scale.
Wow. Jonathan, it's amazing. We're talking about situations where solution to perceived problems, performance problems don't align with organizational goals.
Isn't it?
Or that organizational goals don't align with business goals.
Yeah. Or business
and that happens. Yeah, it happens so often, and it's usually negative. There are exceptions to this. Let's talk about an exception at first. There are some goals in organizations that don't align with business goals that are critical, I think, and that is things such as what some people call equity goals.
Sure.
An attempt to, for example, improve the way that we make, not make such biased decisions about women or minorities in organizations. There are other kinds of goals maybe that are not business goals that are important for the health and the well-being of an organization. But there are investments in human capital, let's say. That's one way to put it. Mm-hmm. But on the whole, the evidence suggests that when individual performance is aligned with measurable organization goals that are themselves focused on business goals, the average benefit, I think this was a McKinsey, I'm going to describe some McKinsey data.
Sure.
That the average benefit for a publicly traded companies was huge, if I remember. An average of about 60% return on equity, 40% greater return on assets, more or less, and almost 8% more for shareholders.
Presumably this is over some period of years, correct?
Over a period of time, right. But think of it as that does not necessarily mean that the best evidence was used in that. I think that's really very impressive. You ask how it could be done effectively. Well, to us, in order to achieve maximum alignment, it's necessary to have goals for each level of the entire organizational goals reflect and support the goals at the next highest level in the organization.
Sure.
And it starts at the top. You have to begin with what the goal is for the organization. And then we use the term cascading goals. Most important that each goal in the organization, whether it's adjacent divisions or whether it's different layers in the organization, have to support the goals above and below them. And I think that's often a challenging process, but hey, Jonathan, if you don't have a direction, you're not going to get there. If you don't know where you're headed and aren't really clear about that, and if where you're headed isn't for financial success, what are you doing?
Exactly. I want to double down here and combine your insights from the first question. You give us a process on how to do this, but let's look at why this doesn't get done. The benefits, as you clearly laid out, are quite significant. And this is not a huge investment of hundreds of thousands of dollars in order to have cascading goals. So what are the barriers of resistance in both leadership and organization, behaviors and mindset that lead to this huge resource being undertapped?
That's a really great question. I think that there's a lot of myths out there about goals and how to set them and how they have to, what they have to look like and so on.
Ooh,
and I think part of it is that CEOs and management groups have a sense that their goal is to inspire people. And it's true. Motivating your people and trying to convince them that what they're doing is really important, that the goal of the organization is important, and that if it survives and does well, so will they. But the bottom line here is that goals like do your best, get market share, a number of other goals are just simply not specific enough to lead anybody to know how to work towards achieving what's important.
Sure. So, Dr. Clark, I'd like to follow up a little bit on Jonathan's question. And that is, what would you offer up for our listeners as a review of your strategy for setting organizational and human performance goals? Can you maybe drill down a little bit more on that?
Yeah, Jack, we actually use an approach session by a couple of guys named Ed Locke and Gary Latham. They are the goal meisters of the country, in my view. They've studied all the research, actually conducted a lot of it, and best practice in organizations on both organizational and personal goals for, 25, 30 years now. And what's interesting about what they have found, and I'm going to summarize it here pretty quickly, but because this could be a long discussion, their findings to me were very counterintuitive. And this may be another reason why we have difficulty setting goals. For example, when they polled people, they found that they thought goals really needed to be not that difficult, so that people would feel that it was not easy, but easy enough to accomplish them. And that if they were too difficult, people would avoid them. They found the reverse was true. The goals have to be both very difficult and also perceived as difficult, but possible to achieve for an organization and for groups, teams, and individuals in the organization. So that's the first quality goals have to have. They've got to be perceived as and be very difficult. Secondly, this is not a surprise, I think, and that is that they need to be specific and measurable. This is where you have to avoid the do your best kinds of goals, okay?
Right.
Thirdly, and this was a bit of a surprise to me, is that goals need to be, they call them current goals, but really they need to be about the near future. Goals need to be for this week, this month, at the outside this quarter, not for this year or next year. There's some good reasons for that, I think, that we could talk about later if you want to, but that's a very important thing, that the more immediate, the more current the goals, the more effective they are. And finally, the one we've been talking about, with goals have to be consistent. They have to be linked between organizations and divisions, and that there was one other thing. There was a lot of controversy about how to arrive at the statement of goals that you want to use.
Yes.
And there was arguments about, did it need to be precipitative? Did people need to have the dialogue and come to agreement, even vote on it? Should it be handed top down? It's management's decision. They impose goals on other people, et cetera. And they found out it really didn't matter. And they believe that there may be some cultural issues here. And that in some countries, maybe some cultures or some organizational cultures, participation in goal setting might be more effective. And in others, it might be better just to hand the goals to people and say, this is what we need you to do. So that, I think, is more of an open question that just needs some analysis. And especially with multinational corporations, I think there's some issues there. But generally, it's that they need to be difficult, specific, immediate, and consistent.
Dr. Clark, this is fascinating, partly because it's counterintuitive. I mean, when I think about this in the context of organizations, we're now looking at setting very challenging, sort of difficult rather than just sounding difficult goals, of course, specific and measurable. And the timeline to achieve those is compressed for week, month, or quarter rather than forecasting out for half year or year. And again, we're asking for the organizational, division, team, and individual goals to be cascading. I mean, that is a real shift on the state of goals.
Let me make sure that I understand, because one of the things that's happening out there quite often, way too often to me, is that some managers feel that if they give people impossible goals, some people call them stress goals. There's other terms that I've heard that aren't quite as polite. But basically, it says, here's what you have to do, and you take one look at it and say, there's no way. I can't achieve that goal.
Yeah.
There are managers that feel that, oh, well, that's fine. They'll just work a whole lot harder to get even closer to it than they would have if I had scaled back the goal. Doesn't happen. That works against you in almost all situations that anybody's found.
I'm so glad
it has to be possible for a person to achieve the goal.
Yeah. So difficult, very, very difficult, but not unrealistic. I mean, there's a line there where you don't want to cross that line. Right.
And if you're in doubt about it, then, and it's not your area, consult with people that know about it.
Right.
This is really important to highlight. The insight here is not to make the most difficult goal. If I understand you correctly, Dr. Clark, so please feel free to confirm this. But the insight is not to pick the very difficult, impossible goal, but the goal needs to be both very difficult to achieve, but possible, and perceived as very difficult. So it almost feels to be a worthy goal for it to really drive motivation.
Exactly. And that is the purpose for the difficult part. It's a motivational thing. People value being challenged to the point where they know they can achieve it. They're just going to have to work really hard to do that. And they know if they do achieve it, they'll get recognized for that. And that makes a huge difference in terms of the way that people value what they do.
Absolutely. And we can go further on value and meaning, but I want to take that conversation because one of the things that happens is barriers come up, especially when we're looking at where we are in an organization and where we want to be. And you have a very particular way of defining the gaps in organizations and then recommending that managers and leaders review them. And you bring up 3 critical factors of influence. I want to get a sense of if you can briefly describe them, and then where managers tend to make a mistake in choosing one solution over the other.
Happy to. For a variety of reasons, we decided that we were going to build a gap analysis model around 3 primary categories of factors that are important in an organization. And maybe because we're psychologists, 2 of them are people categories. But I tend to think that people are extraordinarily important, more important than many other things in an organization. So the first category is the knowledge and skills that people have. I mean, people need often to learn more to upskill in order to succeed. Secondly, we think that individual and team motivation is grossly overlooked in organizations. We think it's a huge issue. As a matter of fact, the evidence is that it accounts for 40% of people's employment, or people's performance,
40%.
40% of their performance is motivationally based. And by the way, people can't work if they don't know how to do the job. We know that.
Yeah.
But what we don't acknowledge is that people aren't going to work if they're not motivated to do it. They find a way out of it. They get sick. They find an excuse. They They find a distraction. They do whatever it takes. So it turns out that individual and team motivation is a bit different than individual motivation. Maybe we can talk about that a bit later. Both of those things are both facilitators and stoppers. Again, because maybe we're psychologists, the third category probably lumps together things that people would like to separate. So our third category is organizational policy and procedure, and the facilities and equipment people have is often very important to their succeeding. So it's those three categories: knowledge and skill, individual and team motivation, and organizational policy, procedure, facilities, and equipment.
So, Dr. Clark, can you share with our listeners a couple of things to follow up on that point? Can you maybe share some of the questions that need to be asked at each one of these levels, number one? And number two, what are some of the, maybe some of the mistakes that you see companies making the most when they try to apply your gap analysis model within their organization?
Sure. Let's talk about first what each one of them is. Knowledge and skills, the first influencer, those are familiar to everyone. But there's so many problems when we design our person's training to handle performance challenges. And I'm going to say the first one. By the way, before I say this, let me make it clear that one of my primary specialties is training, the design of highly complex training. One of the reasons I was a professor of surgery and not being a physician is because we developed ways to teach surgeons that were enormously successful for med schools. And so I'm committed to it. But my experience after working in a great variety of organizations is that it's tempting to throw training at people when there's a problem without checking to see if the people that are being trained actually know how to do it or could figure it out. And so, actually, we do have training departments in many organizations. I notice we don't have motivation departments. We don't have organizational policy and procedure departments and so on. Okay. All right. So the second thing to me is that it's amazing to me that evidence of popular training systems can result in poorer performance after training than what existed before. In other words, it's possible to make people more ignorant with training. In these studies, for example, they pre-test what people know about something, then they give them training and they post-test them afterwards to see what they know and can do. So they're not only memory tests, they're application tests. And they find out when they use certain kinds of popular training systems, people actually know less after training than they did, and they're less able to perform without making mistakes.
Dr. Clark, I need to pause you here for a second because this is such an important insight. And I want to highlight this for our listeners. Are you saying that training, there's a common assumption that training is additive, that you can never have too much training. And if you do, it just stops producing results like horsepower in a car. But it sounds like what you're saying is that poorly executed or too much training or the wrong kind of training is actually a deterrent to productivity and insight and knowledge being available. Is that right?
Isn't it amazing that all of us commonly believe that in most professions, when a professional makes a mistake, it's negative. Bad things can happen. Well, why don't we assume that about training or about teaching for that matter? It's a profession. It's important. Providing people with things that are really important to them. And you know what? I think that we conducted the only survey of research that demonstrated this process. When we looked a number of years ago, we found 70 different studies in a huge number of areas, huge number of kinds of learning, huge number of industry, different subject matter, different students, where after training, people knew significantly less than they did before they started. When we tried to replicate that study recently, we couldn't find anything. You know why? Journals no longer publish failed results. They ignore it when somebody turns in a study that said, we assumed that this was going to be beneficial, but in fact it worked against us. They won't publish it.
We're going to have to get you back on at some point to talk about p-hacking and the things we don't see that aren't published in journals. But this is an incredible insight. But I want to refocus from Jack's question. How do we actually do it? The gap analysis. What are the questions that we can actually start to ask ourselves, aware of our own biases, that'll help us recognize the common mistakes? What does that process look like?
Well, that's fair enough. There are a number of different gap analysis models out there that business schools talk about. I'm not sure that it matters which one you use, provided they have some similar elements in them. We chose one that was actually developed by the Institute for Performance Improvement, and it's a 7-step model. Now, let me briefly describe it. The first 3 steps are measurement steps, and they ask the following questions. What's our performance goal? And keep in mind, we're asking that at every level in the organization. What is it? Where are we now related to the goal? So as you see, that performance goal has to be measurable. We have to have measures of it. We have to know where we are. And then in step 3, we subtract where we are from where we want to be. And that gives us the gap.
Sure.
So there's the basis of the beginning of a gap analysis model. Well, that's pretty standard stuff. What we feel we've added is some insight about the next couple of steps, because the next step is always, what's causing this gap? How do we get from where we are to where we want to be? And then the 5th step follows from once we identify what the cause of the gap is, what will close the gap. All right? So let's step back a second. What we've learned with this model and its application over the years is that the biggest mistake that organizations make is at step 4. What is causing the gap? What happens at step 4, and this relates to what we've been talking about, is that very few managers making this decision actually sit and analyze at this point. They go from recognizing there's a gap to almost instantly thinking that, oh, I know what'll close this gap. I've got a solution for this. This is the slice thing that I think Malcolm Gladwell is talking about. It's a natural part thing that our brain does. And so our take is that happens in large part because people have a whole series of solutions that they're committed to. And in a sense, they're kind of waiting for problems that they think that they can apply the solution to. So they don't really analyze the cause of the gap. They quite instantly have a solution, and therefore then they reason that, well, the solution is designed to help something that must be the cause. They implement it, but do they assess whether it works or not? Because step 6 is, how do we implement the solution in a cost-effective way? And step 7 is, how do we measure progress? And then we wrap around to, did we reduce the gap between where we are now and the goal? And if we didn't, why not? And we go back and take a look again. That's the model that we're using right now. Matter of fact, the whole book is built around that model. 7 steps. Let me quickly go through them again. What's our goal? Where are we now? Number 2. Number 3, what's the measured size of the gap between the goal and where we are? Number 4, what's causing the gap? Is it skills or knowledge? Is it motivation? And or is it organizational policy, procedure, equipment availability, and so on? By the way, we have a number of case studies in the book that are pretty representative of organizations. And one of the things we learned is that organizational equipment is, in a lot of organizations, one of the reasons why there's problems. That it's inadequate, it hasn't been received, it's out of inventory, whatever it is. And yet, when there's a problem, the assumption is it's a problem because people don't know how to do something, rather than that they don't have the tools that they need to do it.
Yeah, and I think just a comment, when you look at your model, it's really to help, provide this very systematic kind of approach, which is really founded in research and founded in principle. But it seems to me, especially with number 4, what is causing the gap, unless you kind of have this approach and you use, this type of model, it seems a lot of organizations are quick to assume or what that gap actually is, and or they identify gaps that are maybe most visible. And sometimes these gaps can be a little more abstract, right? A little harder to see, a little harder to pinpoint, but yet that's really the root cause. And I think the way that your gap analysis model, works is really to bring focus to number 4. What's really causing the gap? Is it knowledge? Is it motivation? Is it organization? And I think that kind of helps, organizations really kind of take that step back and just kind of think about, the different influences that may be causing that gap to begin with.
Yep. And how you conduct that analysis of the gap is, I think, can be somewhat challenging. I mean, we have talked about very many different ways, putting together focus groups, for example, of people that are deeply involved in making this happen, trying to reach some consensus about it, and then going out and seeing whether the guess that the focus group has actually is accurate or not. If they think people don't know, go find out whether they do or not before you invest in a huge training system.
Right.
If you think they don't have incentives that are adequate, find that out. Ask them, try some incentives, whatever it is. Go out and actually talk to people about it, and then take a look once you decide which one or more of what we think are the 3 main issues here are going to be the things we have to address. It's often 2 of them.
Yeah.
So it's not usually just one thing.
I want to highlight that because so often there's a reductionist view. Just a comment here. I see organizations do step 1, 2, and 3 really well. MBAs have a unique talent for finding out what's wrong and seeing that. The real question here is there seems to be a desire not to sit with the question of number 4. What's causing this? What are the factors that are at play here, and how do they work interconnectedly? There's a jump to that solution, and how do we fix it? I want to ask you, where can we support organizations who are really good at analyzing, okay, there's a gap, and they want to jump to solutions? What does the process look like in your work of supporting them in step 4?
I'm going to sound like a person that wants professionals not to trust themselves anymore, and I really don't feel that way. People with a lot of experience in an organization have a wealth of knowledge to give that organization. But what I'd like to do is convince people that being certain about things is not helpful. Having warranted uncertainty, saying to yourself, well, I think it's this, but it probably would be a good idea for me to get more evidence about that. And so what constitutes evidence in that situation? Confirmation, maybe, from people that are working in that area. There may be records kept that they can look. I mean, in every instance, there's something different. But keep in mind something. If you're going to implement a solution, if you're going to try to solve the problem and narrow that gap, you're going to invest quite a bit of time and funds in that organization. And you're better off to spend a little bit more time before you do that.
Dr. Clark,
was there more in that question? I actually think that there's no neat way to do this. We describe a number of different strategies in that book that organizations have used. But I've come to the conclusion that there are different things that work in different instances, and you just have to be confident that you've invested whatever you can to analyze that cause before you go forward. And keep in mind that your instinct, your mind is going to be pushing you to stop analyzing and get busy to do something. And you have to overcome that.
So, Dr. Clark, I'd like to take Jonathan's question just a step further, and so, his question was regarding selecting the most effective solution to close that gap. My question is relating to further on down the 7 questions that you ask, right? But even if you are able to close those gaps, how can the organization actually be ensured that the bottom line business needs have been met, right? So the whole purpose here is to meet organizational performance goals and be able to identify if you've met that goal. So how do you do that?
That's a great question, because what you have to keep in mind is that within any part of an organization, you're interdependent to other parts. You have responsibilities to them, and you have benefits you should be getting from them. And one of the responsibilities is to make sure that if you close your gap and you're achieving your goals, that's actually supporting organizations that depend on you and what you're doing for the organization in order to succeed themselves.
Right.
So somebody's got to be keeping track of all these cascading goals. and whether somebody actually solved a problem, reduced a gap in an area, and it made no difference to the adjacent, let's call them, parts of the organization. Well, maybe something's wrong with the goals that they have. Maybe we need to take a look at that.
Yeah.
So this is a dynamic system. I almost think of it as something that's alive in a good organization. It's constantly changing. It's constantly evolving. And if we pay attention to it systematically, the organization can grow as fast as possible and achieve as much as it's capable of doing. It's very exciting when we invest effort to make them work.
Dr. Clark, I'm struck and find myself really interested in the organic model, that it's interconnected between different parts of the organization. And it's a totally different frame than the mechanical siloed approach. So I'm so excited that that's coming to your forefront.
This is, can I say one other thing? This is really interesting to me, that the whole idea of gap analysis came out of people that study plants and ecology. And
did it really?
Yeah. And the interesting thing is that what they learned about plants, forests, fields, and so on, is that plants are all interconnected, that the same process exists in nature, that there's a compensation process, that there's interconnections and even communication between different plants. I mean, there's a number of different books now that are describing this. And I'm not talking about anything mystical. I'm just talking about the fact that, in a sense, we're trying to represent biological and natural processes in an industry. And the way we do that is to interconnect the way that we monitor and measure our decisions and their impact on the organization.
I think that is such a powerful model. I learned something just in this conversation, many things in this conversation. I want to dive a little deeper into a separate but related topic here. As practitioners and researchers, I've seen it and I've had many conversations that show us, and you mentioned it earlier, that motivation is such a significant tool for organizational performance. Oftentimes, when I'm having these conversations, the predictable pushback is we don't have time to sit with the situation. We're going to end up in analysis paralysis, and we're not going to actually do something. I want to have you speak to that criticism and really explore, what is it about that challenges organizations from doing the work of cascading goals?
Well, thanks for that question, Jonathan. It's so important because, in my experience, it's the one that's often used. This analysis paralysis issue is used as an excuse not to do analysis. And in your industry, analysis to me is everything, and I don't see any reason why people should discourage using it in the organizations that support the industry. There are ways, I think, around this issue, and I want to be sympathetic with people that worry about this, because so often in organizations, particularly today when so many changes are taking effect, they have very little time to achieve goals. And so what we've done is suggest something we call the 75-25 rule. And that is, whatever time you have to decide what you're going to do to identify a problem and think about a solution to it, take 75% of that time to analyze and find the solution that you can feel confident about, 25% of the time to mount it and implement it. And our take is that that is the best way to do it. If you got a day, do it. If it has to be done by tomorrow, take 75% of that time to think carefully and analyze, and only 25 to 30% of the time to get it mounted and implemented. The medical profession has a wonderful rule. I learned from them, and you hear it, but you don't repeat it to yourself often enough. Remember, the rule is first do no harm. And so when harm is possible, harking back to the discussion we just had, that when we do these things wrong, they can leave things worse than they were before we started. Analysis absolutely pays off. In general, we have to be wary that if I have, when I think I have no uncertainty about something, I stop and back up and say, there has to be something here that could go wrong, and think about it before I go forward.
Interesting.
I'm nodding my head in agreement.
Dr. Clark, I would like to pry a little further to this idea you mentioned earlier, in that you can actually make organizational performance go backwards. You mentioned in your book that, quote, performance research provides a great deal of evidence that a significant number of very popular education and performance improvement products simply do not work, unquote. Can you, not to put you on the spot, but can you think of any examples, whether concrete or just theoretical examples of common and often applied performance improvement strategies that do not work or make performance worse?
Sure. It's almost like how much time do we have? I'm gonna have to just choose a few that I think might be most interesting to people.
We're obviously, we're talking about a process that does work. With your gap analysis model, I think that's well established. So I was just curious to kind of flip it, look at the other side of that coin, and get your thoughts on what you see as certainly what doesn't work.
Let me mention a few, and then I'm always mentioning books. Do professors always do that? But I think there's a great book out there right now that has a whole list of these things. All right,
Please do it.
Here's some. One of the things I think started out in training, which is the belief that there are different kinds of people in training that need different kinds of training. For example, the Myers-Briggs types, verbal and visual learners, the beliefs that different age groups like Gen Xers or millennials need different kinds of support to perform. And all those are wrong. There are no multiple intelligences. There are no visual and verbal learners. I'm sorry, it's a disappointment in a way. I started out my career as an individual different psychology and had to disabuse myself of most of the things that I had heard were important. There's two things that are important to people when they're being trained. One is, how much do they know about what it is that they're going to learn? So people with much more prior knowledge, experts, actually don't need training, or they need very little. Job aids, let's say. But most people need not discovery learning, which is the most popular approach out there right now. Discovery learning is you give people a tough problem that's related to the job, and they figure out how to solve it in a group collaboratively, and what they learn from that is their training. That's discovery learning. And guess what? It doesn't work. It doesn't work at all. But it's still really popular because it's cheap and it's quick, and it makes people responsible for what they learn. What works, it turns out, is something called fully guided instruction, where you show people how to do things step by step, when to do it, so they're clear about the conditions under which they apply what they've learned, and then you have to give them a chance to have hands-on practice. And when they're practicing, they need feedback about whether they're doing it the correct way or not. Fair enough? So that's the whole thing about individual differences and training strategies. There's also, do you want to go on with this? I mean, there's also a newer personality system out there that the American Psychological Association has developed. It's called the Big Five. And these have solid, hard evidence. There are many instances where these Big Fives are helpful, not so much in training, but in selection and in deciding who does what kind of job effectively. Shall I list the Big Five? Are you curious, just quickly?
We would love to hear it.
Conscientiousness, openness to experience. The third one, I think, is extroversion. That's an old one, whether you're more extroverted or introverted. The fourth one is agreeableness. And the fifth one is called neuroticism, but it's actually how negative are you? I mean, some people are really negative. And by the way, they're very valuable because they're always alert to problems. Negative people don't see positives, they see potential problems. And so I think they're important in teams anyway. So that replaces all the other individual things. Oh, here's another one, feedback. Feedback research was another one that broke my mind because it indicated, there's two guys named Kluger and Denisi that looked at all the feedback studies in all the countries that published them. And that was not only in English, but other countries, because they want to know whether there were cultural differences in the feedback that worked, that is performance feedback, feedback during training, whatever it is. And they found that 1/3 of all of the popular feedback strategies in the world made performance worse. They found that another third made no difference whatsoever, and only a third of those approaches actually paid off. Wow, that's really interesting. And what worked, actually, was telling people that what they did well, this was correct, that did well, that really added to your group, and what strategy they needed to modify in order to be more successful. Not what they did wrong, but how could they correct the strategy that they were applying so that it worked better? Whether that strategy was the way they were dealing with other people, whether it was some work task that they were performing, didn't matter too much. The approaches that hurt, that made things worse, were when people were criticized and blamed for mistakes. I have a brother that's a Marine that tells me he thinks in the Marines that would cause a revolution. And that, by the way, I think in the Marines what they do works because it's about building unit coherence. But this is not the Marines we're in. This is in an organization of professionals. And telling people they were stupid or they made a mistake or they caused a problem, while they'll handle it, they're mature, they'll act as if it's fine. But believe me, the evidence is it goes back on you and it causes trouble.
Dr. Clark, this is just a fascinating, very insightful conversation. So thank you so much. I know that if you still have a few moments, Jonathan has one more question and I have one more question I'd love to ask. But before we do that, I want to insert, just as you were talking about, these 5 components, these 5 ideas, it got me thinking about, so I've read some different studies about what makes a good leader and what leadership attributes help bring out the best in people in terms of individual performance, organizational performance. And so I was thinking about a couple of articles I had in mind, but then I recalled you had a conversation with somebody recently. It was in one of your videos I was watching. And you'd mentioned the same word came up, and you'd mentioned a study in which took a look at teachers, and they wanted to look at what made an effective teacher, right? And so bottom line was the common denominator between those 2 studies, whether you were an executive, organizational leader, or a teacher, was empathy. And this idea of being able to work with individuals and bringing out the best in them. So it just kind of off topic maybe a little bit, but any thoughts on that?
It is really important. Yeah. And the interesting thing is that empathy is not a personality. Empathy is a strategy.
Yeah,
it's right. how you react to people. It's whether you're willing and to some extent able, but it's mostly willing to take a look at the world from their point of view and to confirm their point of view. Oh, I can understand how you feel that way. Yeah, wow, that must be tough. Or I am so happy for you that you had that experience. I'm imagining how I would feel. I mean, one of the difficulties that we find is that a lot of technical organizations, you do have people who are, more on what they call the autism spectrum, where expressing empathy is extremely difficult for them. But they can learn to do that. They can learn to do it. And that's what's really important. I mean, we all know highly technical people who just are not people at all. And what we mean by that is they don't really express empathy a whole lot. They're not trying to see the world from other people's point of view. And they can learn, teach them, encourage them. They can succeed at it.
Interesting.
Dr. Clark, my head is spinning and nodding at the same time. I'm sure that's not physically possible, but that's certainly how I feel listening to you, because insights are both counterintuitive and incredibly meaningful. So I want to first thank you for providing that and being here. I also want to say, one of the poor reasons I had experienced in your book for you writing your book was that you wanted to know what we know and know what we don't know. And I really want to take a second and tie your first comment together with why practitioners and executives don't often sit with, well, what am I curious about here? What do I think I know 100%? And how can we be more aware about what we know, what we don't know, and inspire that curiosity?
It's a great issue, Jonathan. I actually think people need to think of their professional responsibility is to know as much of what is known about what they do as they can. That is, what kind of research-based knowledge is out there? And then secondly, and more importantly almost, what is known about what I need to know to achieve my part of my performance goals in this organization and to help other people achieve their goals. And that means when you have time and your curiosity is focused on something, let it be curious. Get yourself curious about knowing what is known that's research-based about what you're doing. Nobody can know it all. One of the reasons why we go to outside consultants, I think, and consultant organizations is that they have the job of knowing what is known about what they specialize in. And if they're good at what they do, they know more or less what's known out there, or they know how to go find it out. And I think that's critical too.
Yeah.
Also important to know what we don't know, because there are things that there's not a lot of research about. But I'll tell you, a lot of people tell me I looked for that and I couldn't find anything, and I'm usually realizing they didn't look hard enough. Luckily, we have the internet. We've got professional organizations that try to put this stuff together. There are ways that we can do that, but being clear about what we're now trying to learn and what it is we don't know is really important. And I think there's a third category in there too, Jonathan, which is not knowing what we don't know.
Absolutely,
so
Dr. Clark.
In other words, what are those issues that we don't know about? To me, having found out that experts are so unconscious about their knowledge, the evidence is the brain has to automate everything that it repeats over and over again because we have so little space in consciousness to think through and solve problems. I think that's one of the weird things about evolution is that we've evolved to have so little conscious space to think. Our memory is probably not infinite, but it's larger than anybody realizes. We can remember things. It's just that we can't analyze things with a lot of effort. So the brain just converts what we think worked into an automatic approach, and it makes it unconscious. And that is both a benefit and the worst problem that we encounter.
This conversation reminds me of what friend and colleague Ron West calls being unconsciously incompetent. We don't know what we don't know, and it's just being able to take that step back and reflect and maybe better understanding what it is we don't know.
Exactly. Creating that wake up call, as he calls it.
Yep.
So, Dr. Clark, I guess in concluding our conversation today, and again, thank you so much, but I do have one more question for you. I know that you and colleague Dr. Saxberg had an article, I believe it was in March of 2019, that was in the Harvard Business Review, and it was titled 4 Reasons Good Employees Lose Their Motivation. And you described diagnosing and solving work motivation problems. And in addition, you and Dr. Saxberg published a related research article titled Engineering Motivation Using a Belief Expectancy Control Framework. And to me, this is just fascinating. This is incredibly interesting work. And we are certainly going to have you back on just to spend an hour discussing this work. But would you mind providing just a brief summary of these 2 articles and what you mean when you talk about belief expectancy?
Yeah, Broer Saxberg, and Broer, by the way, is an MD, PhD. This guy's got more experience and degrees than anybody I know, and he works for the Zuckerbergs now, I think. Broer and I noticed that most of the research in motivation was fragmented. People were dealing with only a piece of it. It was like the elephant problem, where somebody knows the toenail, somebody else is dealing with the tail, and we decided to try to pull it all together into a model. We did. And we published it and the research that supported it, and that got a lot of attention. So the Harvard Business Review asked us to summarize it. So here's a quick summary. We find that there's 3 things that define motivation. Starting a task, that is, people either avoid or they procrastinate and risk failure. Persisting at a task once started, particularly when you have distractions. and to finish the task on time and up to whatever standards are there. And the third thing is investing adequate mental effort to succeed at the task. And the four things that the Harvard Business Review article focused on was, what are the four things that either help or hinder starting, persisting, and investing adequate mental effort when we're working?
Yeah. Sure.
And those four things are values. You value what you're doing. And by the way, it's not the value that the manager has, it's the value that the person doing the task has. Fair enough? I mean, it's really easy to think everybody shares our values, and they don't. This is a huge difference. Second, people can lack confidence. They hide it because it's not considered to be socially acceptable to express a lack of confidence, but underconfidence is a big factor here. Oh, a bigger factor is overconfidence. We're absolutely certain we know how to do something, we know what needs to be done, and in fact, we're wrong. And so when we make a mistake, it's not our fault. It's somebody else or something else that screwed up.
This is finally confidence bias again.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, right.
And then a thing that's so hard to control and almost never talked about, but it turns out to be one of the biggest issues in decision making, and that is strong emotions. We lead a very strong emotional life. We learn how to hide them if they're negative, but those negative emotions, or even some of the positive ones, direct us in a way that keeps us from analyzing. You say, oh, hell, I'm sick of this stuff. I just want to get on with it.
Yeah.
And you stop the analysis and jump to a conclusion that turns out to get you into trouble.
Yeah.
We've just finished a course. I just finished designing a course with a colleague that's based on this, that tries to teach people, first of all, how to diagnose motivation problems, theirs and others. And secondly, once they're diagnosed, how to solve them.
Fascinating. Just incredible work, Dr. Clark. We would love to have you back on here at some point. I would love to dig into that work a little bit more. Dr. Clark, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it. We're delighted for your time and your insight. And for all of our listeners, Turning Research into Results, A Guide to Selecting the Right Performance Solutions, is highly recommended. That's the book that we were focused on for the most part today. The book is used in doctorate level studies and research, but it's also a great read for all practitioners in the organizational performance field because, as Dr. Clark had mentioned, sound principle makes for sound practice.
Dr. Clark, such a pleasure to have you on. I enjoyed this conversation immensely, and I look forward to diving further into how we make better decisions when we get you on next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jack and Jonathan. Thanks for the opportunity.
We are excited and grateful to have friends, colleagues, and mentors join us on our podcast. We have an incredible lineup of ERP organizational change speakers, authors, professors, researchers, pioneers in the field, practitioners, PE partners, business executives, ERP vendors, and organizational stakeholders. Please join us for our next episode as Ron West joins us to discuss transformational leadership. Ron is an expert, a keynote speaker, an accomplished business leader, and accredited executive coach. Please join us for our authentic conversation with Ron as he shares his passion with an insightful practice to build leadership, understand and apply the basis of vertical development, and explore how we can wake up to consciousness.
Thank you, listeners, for being with us as we seek to, 1, promote, connect, and foster relationships in the ERP organizational change community, 2, contribute to the field of ERP organizational change, and 3, bring research and practice closer together. Please join us again next week as we discuss the latest in ERP organizational change research, practice, and stories. Our podcast will draw on the knowledge from extensive research, collaborative learning, and practitioner expertise and experience.
Once again, you've been listening to the ERP Organizational Change Journal podcast. From everyone here on the team, Jack and myself, we wish you a great week, and we hope to see you again soon on another episode. Take care.